Hello, welcome to the lecture from Module 1, What is Well-Being? This is KNH 214, Global Well-Being. I'm your instructor, Dr. J. Kimichik, and I'm recording this lecture from my office on the beautiful campus of Miami University. So, a couple of things before we get started. This will be a series of lectures for Module 1. I use a software that only allows me 15 minutes for each lecture. It's free. So that's why I use it. This lecture is primarily to give you some information, provide you some background on Module 1, what is well-being, and to help prepare you for the quiz, for Quiz 1. So let's get started. As far as the outline goes, I'll give you some quick personal stuff. I'll try to keep this as simple as possible, but well-being is very complex. We'll get into what is well-being, what is happiness, get into the aspects of culture. Of course, this is global well-being, so of course we'll get into culture. And then why is well-being important or relevant? I'll give an example from health, from the health area. Make sure you go into forum and put in something unique about yourself, your first and last name. One unique thing about me is I'm 100% Polish, and a favorite place of mine is the basketball court because I love the feel of the swish. So make sure you go onto forums and do that, getting to know you or something unique about you. There's two Dr. J's, of course. That's me on the left, Dr. J, the real Dr. J on the right. If you're not a basketball fan, this really doesn't matter, but it will show you my age based on that uniform. I've got two things in common with Venus Williams. One you could probably figure out. The other one will be a little bit more challenging for you. If you're curious or interested, you can do some research and perhaps find out. If you want to email me, if you think you have the answer, I'll give you 1 point on your quiz. So that's why it's good to listen to the lecture, because you never know. Some questions to ponder about this course really come from a reading from Veenhoven from Module 3 in terms of some bigger picture questions. And I'm not going to go through all 7 of these, but do all humans appraise how much they like their lives will be one of the kinds of questions. Certainly number 3, are all conditions for happiness similar for all humans? This gets into cultural differences, different places around the world, different countries. Number 4, similar thing in terms of around the globe. Are the consequences of you being happy similar for people who live in the US compared to people who live in France or Asia or wherever it might be? So these are some good questions to ponder. And again, you have the PowerPoints at your disposal. You can go back in and take a peek at these questions. But this course covers a few of these questions. Why is there a need for well-being? The current situation now calls for a health revolution on the basis of a view of health as a resource for everyday life. So this is from Dr. Lester Breslow, who was a public health professor at UCLA, and we're really getting into what might be perceived by some, at least, in terms of getting into well-being as kind of the third revolution in health, and I'll explain that right now. I'll do this kind of quickly, but this is why I said it does get a little complex. The first era of health really got into disease and helping people from not dying because of the focus on acute and infectious disease. We eradicated many of those diseases. We then moved into the second era, which was on an increased focus on chronic disease, which is kind of the era we're in now. I would say we're getting into kind of a changing of the guard and a transition between the second and the third era. So the second era really was just on reducing chronic disease and prolonging disability-free life. A lot of focus on disease and disease management. The third era, according to Breslow, would be this increased focus on achieving optimal health, and that's where well-being comes into the picture. So we're kind of moving into this third era of health. It's important for you at least to appreciate or understand that, hey, there's probably these 3 eras. The first era was more infectious disease. The second era was chronic disease, and the third era is now more of this focus on achieving optimal health. I'll get into that a little bit more when we get into what is well-being. So why is there a need for this well-being? As I've said, we're kind of stuck in this era 1.0, 2.0, you know, the chronic disease kind of mindset. We need kind of this three-point era philosophy and approach with optimal well-being at the core. Now, will we get there is the question. So you need kind of a brief history lesson. I've kind of taught myself a little bit about the history of era 1.0, era 2.0, and why we have really some challenges of getting into this era of well-being. So a brief history lesson. Actually, the Greeks were freaks because they had this kind of figured out way back when. Holism, which is really a Greek word meaning all or total, kind of fits the idea of well-being. So the Greeks were on it way back when. Aristotle being one of them. He's one of my favorite philosophers, and I actually read him in my spare time. But then, you know, the Roman Empire took over, and that, we know what happened to that. The Dark Ages came along. As you can see from this picture, they were really dark. Then the Age of Enlightenment came along, and Galileo, who is in this picture, used to do his science with no clothes on. And just FYI, that's how I grade exams and quizzes with online classes. That's a joke. I'm just kidding. I don't know. This is an interesting photo. But was it really the Age of Enlightenment? What they did was they kind of ripped apart the mind and body. Another photo from the Age of Enlightenment. They were really into it. And then we come to Descartes, who was one of the French philosopher, 1500s, 1600s, who's counting, 100 years or so. But I don't know if he was a bad man, a very bad man. This is a Seinfeld reference. Those of you who are very young, as you all are, probably don't even know who Seinfeld is, but it was a very famous comedy. Anyway, so Descartes ripped the mind from the body. As I said, late 1500s, mid 1600s. He said there is nothing included in the concept of body that belongs to the mind, and nothing of that in the mind that belongs to the body. So wow, he really kind of took apart the whole person and split it apart. There's no purpose, life, or spirituality in matter. And we lived with this model and have lived with this model for a very long time, coinciding with this era 1.0, era 2.0. Some call it the biomedical model. But Descartes was really one of the key leaders of this movement, which is part of the Enlightenment. Now, I would say over the past 50 to 75 years or so, we've been trying to come out of the shadows of Descartes and the biomedical model and put the human being back together. You can see how for the last 100, 200 years, we haven't really focused on well-being or this holistic view of the person. So we are moving towards this more positive, holistic view of humans. It is beginning to emerge, things like wellness and even now well-being. So what is well-being? This is a really important part of Module 1 in terms of understanding what well-being is. There's really all kinds of people writing about well-being, but if you break it down into three main ideas: subjective well-being, hedonic well-being, and eudaimonic well-being. And you at least need to understand the basics of these three key foci of well-being. So what is subjective well-being? Well, it's kind of a broad category of phenomena that includes emotions, domain satisfactions like satisfied with work, satisfied with life, and global judgments of life satisfaction. Ed Diener, a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois, has been on this for 30 years or so. Basically, three components of subjective well-being. You got the pleasant affect, things like joy, the negative affect, like feeling sad, and overall life satisfaction. With life satisfaction, for example, they ask you questions like, in most ways, my life is close to my ideal. I am satisfied with my life. If I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. So this is kind of that life satisfaction component of subjective well-being. So kind of a hodgepodge of things in terms of affect and cognitively evaluating your life. Now, hedonic well-being has seen a lot of attention over the last 20 to 30 years. It's similar to subjective well-being, and really hedonic well-being is where kind of happiness lies, so to speak. This is where happiness really fits in terms of this idea of hedonic well-being. Happiness is really the experience of positive affect. Pleasure is also probably contained under hedonic well-being in terms of positive feelings, and so forth. Now, with hedonic well-being, you can have lots of fun, lots of pleasure, lots of happiness, but not really live a meaningful life. And I know sometimes that can sound like a little bit of a contradiction or paradox, but it really is true. And the reason for that is because we have this last component of well-being, which is eudaimonic well-being, which is kind of the realization of one's true potential. You know, can you express yourself in terms of who you really are, your true nature, living in harmony with your innate potentiality. Norton, a philosopher, has written about eudaimonic well-being extensively, where the individual experiences the whole of his life in every act. So you got these three ideas of subjective well-being, hedonic well-being, and eudaimonic well-being. You should at least understand the basic differences between the three, although there certainly is overlap amongst them. It is complicated, but basically, in terms of my understanding of this literature and why it's relevant for us, subjective well-being and hedonic well-being appear to be focused on kind of consequences and outcomes. In other words, you have an experience, you have feelings that relate to it. You have experience, you have judgments about those feelings. So feelings are judgments about what people value. Now, eudaimonic well-being focuses more on fulfilling our promise or our potential. Each of us is born with kind of this idea of we have a promise to be fulfilled. So the bottom line here is you can be satisfied with your life but not feel fulfilled in terms of like subjective well-being or hedonic well-being, but if you don't have purpose and meaning, you may not have that feeling of fulfillment. So you could have pleasure but not purpose. Now, of course, you could have both, but you can also have purpose and not pleasure. In terms of if you really are into something that's really meaningful to you, you may not be happy all the time while you're doing it. So just to kind of show you a quick figure, and then we're going to probably run out of time here with our 15 minutes in terms of our first lecture. But you see from this figure, you have level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 really focuses on this momentary feelings, right? Joy and pleasure. That would probably be more hedonic well-being, right? Then Nettle says that we have maybe this level 2, where we have our judgments about feelings. This would be probably more of the subjective well-being, where you kind of take a cognitive, reflective look at your life, right? In terms of how does it feel most of the time. So this gets into more of this subjective well-being or, life satisfaction, right? And then Nettle ends with this level 3, which is more of this quality of life, flourishing, fulfilling one's potential. What does that sound like? That doesn't sound like hedonic well-being. It doesn't sound like subjective well-being. It sounds like eudaimonic well-being, right, in terms of this idea. So you have these three levels in terms of Nettle's, the author from one of our readings from Module 1, I believe it's reading number 2, gets into this. You need to understand these basic ideas of well-being, of happiness. So where does happiness fit? Probably more with hedonic well-being, right, in terms of some ideas. So I'm going to end here, and we'll pick up the next lecture getting into a little bit more on eudaimonia or eudaimonic well-being in terms of its relevance and getting some cultural differences with happiness and well-being. So, go Aristotle, the man.